My privilege tonight is to introduce the keynote speaker, and I'm standing in the way of that till I get done. I had the great privilege of meeting, at the time, Governor Kaine, when he was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee asked to serve by Barack Obama. I was elected chair in '09, and the governor hosted us in Washington, and it was a wonderful opportunity to get to know him and the leadership style that he has, which is collaborative, inclusive, and open. He took the tools of the Obama '08 campaign and put those into the Democratic National Committee to make sure that every candidate running across the country had those new tools that Barack Obama used in 2008 to get elected. He was actually pretty bold in '07 when he decided to, as the governor of the state of Virginia, to step out and support this little-known senator from Illinois who really, by the advice of political pundits, stood very little chance of winning the Democratic nomination, and certainly not the presidency. He was the first statewide elected official in the United States to support Barack Obama in 2007. And because of that, Barack Obama said, "I need you as my co-chair." And in '08, Governor Kaine and Dick Durbin co-chaired the Barack Obama campaign. The president asked him in '09, "I need somebody at the top of the DNC to run it." He did. And then in 2011, Jim Webb, the United States Senator from Virginia, really in a surprise announcement to many people, indicated he wasn't going to run, and the president again turned to Tim Kaine and said, "I need you to run for the United States Senate. We've got to keep a D beside that name in Virginia," and Senator Kaine stepped up. And the 2012 victory is clear testament, 52-47 victory over George Allen in that race. Couple quick things that you need to know about Senator Kaine. As a young Harvard law student, he decided to take a year off after his first year in law school, and he went to Honduras as a Catholic missionary where he learned Spanish. You can imagine how well that served him in the United States Senate race in the Latino communities all across Virginia. And just this July, in support of the Gang of Eight immigration bill, he delivered a speech on the floor of the United States Senate in Spanish, which had never been done in the history of the United States Senate. Univision loves him, by the way. He was mayor of Richmond, he was lieutenant governor, he was governor, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and now the junior senator from Virginia. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce a rising star in our Democratic Party, someone who was on the short list when Barack Obama was trying to decide who should be his running mate. Please make welcome, with a warm Tennessee Democratic Party welcome, to Senator Tim Kaine.
Hey, 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 you guys look great. Thank you so much. Hello, Tennessee Dems. Thank you. Please have a seat. This is what a warm welcome. I mean, first it's warm and I feel welcome. It is a great crowd. It's been a great evening. I've loved hearing from these mayors. You've got a lot to be proud of in these four mayors. You really do. You've got a lot to be proud of in these mayors. You guys, when I got to be mayor of Richmond, I asked a previous mayor to tell me about the job description of mayor. And this predecessor of mine said to me, "Well, Tim, the job description is this. It's a little bit like fire hydrant. In an emergency, they really need you. And when there's not an emergency, they have other uses for you." That's an inside mayor's joke. But in an emergency, they're going to count on you. And then in other days, they're going to knock you around a little bit. But there is no better job in American politics than being mayor of the cities that you're mayor of, a city like Richmond. And I give such great round of applause and support. Give these guys big, big round of applause. Big, big round of applause. I want to thank Roy, the state chair. He's got a little bit of preacher in him, Roy. I know he has written about faith and politics. Hey, we Democrats are faith and values people, aren't we? The other side says we're not, but we are faith and values people. And you can see that in Roy. I want to thank him for the invite, and I especially want to thank Chip for his kind words. We had a wonderful time working together when I was National Party Chair. To be a county chair, a city chair, a state chair, a national chair, it's not an easy job. It's not an easy job. But we forged a good friendship. We worked well together. I came here to Nashville, came here to Tennessee when I was National Party Chair, and when Chip called and asked if I would come back, it was easy. I'm glad to be back. I'm glad to be a neighbor, Virginia to Tennessee, and it's great to be here with you tonight. And you've heard a lot from the mayors already about one of the messages that I wanted to leave with you, which is, in a tough time, you may just be stepping back and building up your energy for the sprint ahead. And I know it because I've lived it in Virginia. I've lived it in the state just next door. I was elected for my first race in Virginia as a city councilman in 1994, and we were in wilderness years in Democratic politics just next door. You could get elected in a city office like in Richmond, but we were as red can be. When I was elected lieutenant governor in 2001, before that election day when Mark Warner was elected governor, Mark Warner, Jim Cooper's longtime friend from law school, when Mark and I were elected, before that, we had gone more than a decade of loss after loss after loss. 2 Republican senators, no electoral votes behind a Democrat since 1964, overwhelming margins in both houses, all state offices in Republican hands. That's what Virginia was, folks, in 2001. This was 12 years ago in Virginia. We were as red can be. Now we've got 2 Democratic senators. Now we've put electoral votes behind Barack Obama, not once, but twice. Now we've won our state Senate back to 2020. And so as a next-door neighbor, as you're wrestling, Jim talked about looking at the path. What's the path forward to victory? Just real quick, it can happen, and it can happen a lot faster than you think. It can happen a lot faster than you think. It's about organization. It's about getting good candidates. It's about not losing hope. And what we found in Virginia, and you're going to find it here, is when we won that first marquee race, Mark Warner winning the governor's race in 2001, suddenly we had all kinds of people standing up and saying, you know what, actually, I'm a Democrat too. And it was like, well, wait a minute, I've known you for 20 years. I never knew you were a Democrat. Well, I didn't think it was cool to be a Democrat, but once we won a race, I'm going to come and say I'm a Democrat. And what'll happen here, I know this, I've seen it in Virginia, and I've seen it as National Party Chair all around the place. You win that first marquee race, and you're going to see the field tilting, and all the marbles are going to be running your guys' way. And so that's why you don't give up. That's why you organize. That's why you recruit good candidates. That's why you fundraise. And it's going to happen in Tennessee just like it's happening in Virginia. We have gone from one of the reddest states in the country to the state that Chuck Todd at NBC now says is the perfect bellwether state. We're purple and actually trending blue. And this can happen to you if you organize and if you show the passion that you've shown tonight. So that's the good news I'm here to bring. You'll figure out how to do it. You don't need to adopt anybody else's model, but I'm just here to tell you that you can do it, and it'll happen quicker than you think with the kind of energy I'm seeing in this room. So, how about that? So, I tell you, I want to just share a few thoughts with you tonight. You've heard some good speeches, and I don't want to go overly long, but what I wanted to talk to you about was, as you might imagine, as a former governor and senator and as a former National Party Chair, I've been to a number of Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners. Now, this is Jackson Days, I know, and somebody had to tell me it wasn't Alan Jackson, it was Andrew Jackson. Now, I know it is Jackson Day, but this dinner in most states, including Virginia, is a Jefferson-Jackson dinner. And I realized as I was thinking about coming here, for as many Jefferson-Jackson events as I've been to, I've never heard anybody talk about Jefferson or Jackson in any significant way and answer the question, why do we call these things Jefferson-Jackson dinners? So actually, I want to talk about that for a second, but before I do, I hope you will indulge me just for a minute, because while we're all here tonight because we're Democrats, we are all in politics because we care about the country. And we care deeply about the country. And we're as religious and as faith-oriented and as value-based and as patriotic as the other guys. And we do have a big issue on us right now in this country, an issue that we're wrestling with in Washington, that it just wouldn't be right not to say something about Syria. Because it would seem like we were just interested in the flash and the fun and not the hard decisions. And part of what mayors do and part of what senators and members of Congress and part of what we all do is we wrestle with the hard questions. The hard questions on which even we as friends can have some disagreements. And I just didn't think it would be right, especially given how many in the room are veterans? Raise your hand if you're a veteran. Give them a round of applause. Okay? How many in this room have family in the military? Raise your hands if you do, okay? So we've got a lot of connections in this room, and so let me just say a word about Syria, because we're going to be going into a very tough debate, and we're going to need your prayers, and we're going to need some collective wisdom, not only for Congress, but for the world to reach the right outcome of this. But I just want to say a word about it, because we're only here really for the substance. That's why we do what we do. We want to make life better for people. There's two fundamental issues that the President has wrestled with and now asks Congress to grapple with. And they're both very, very important. And the first one is this: when we're going to make a decision like this as a nation, does the President make it or does Congress make it? That's the first issue. And the second issue is, with respect to Syria, what do we do? Do we engage in military action or don't we? Let me talk about the first one for a second, because I think President Obama has done something very courageous and very historic, and that I actually hope will set a historic precedent. From the very beginning of our country, the Constitution was drafted in such a way that the power to initiate military action was specifically given to Congress, not the President. Madison was one of the drafters of the Constitution, and he and Jefferson wrote back and forth about it. And they said, look, executives often want to do this too much, so we got to put this power in Congress. But in our 220-plus year history as a nation, we actually haven't really lived it that way so much. In fact, Congress has declared war 5 times, but presidents have initiated military action more than 125 times without going to Congress first for approval. So we kind of got off track, frankly, and we've been off track, and we've been off track because presidents like to overreach, and Congress often doesn't want to vote. They don't want to say yes or no and be held accountable for their votes. So the president was faced with a pretty tough decision, and he said, I could do what other presidents have done. In fact, I could do what even Barack Obama did with respect to Libya, and I could make the decision myself. But you know what? On a question like this, it is important for 535 senators and members of Congress to have a vote. It's important for the American public to see the debate so that they can be educated and they can learn and they can express their opinion. And I'm watching it up in D.C. I was there all last week in security briefings, and I'm watching people that bash the president, you shouldn't have given it to Congress. That shows you don't have a backbone. You should have made up the decision yourself. Clearly, you're doing this for some political reason. But I can tell you that the president did the right thing. He did the courageous thing. He's turned it over to Congress the way the framers intended, and I am so proud of him for doing that. Now, the other reason that it's important for him to have gotten Congress engaged in this, the Constitution's important enough, but the Constitution is about a moral value, right? So there was a reason that they said put this in Congress's hands, and here's the reason. It is fundamentally unfair of us as a nation to ask our men and women in uniform to carry out a military mission unless the political leadership of the country supports the mission, right? And so, if a president jumps in and says, hey, we're going to do this, but Congress is standing on the sidelines saying, well, we don't like it, or we'd rather not vote one way or the other, how is that for the people who have to go out and carry out the mission when those of us in the leadership class haven't even had that debate, had that discussion, gone on the board and been accountable for it? I got a boy who's a lieutenant in the Marine Corps. I got a nephew who's a naval officer. If they're going to, with millions of others across time, be engaged in military action, then we ought to be darn sure if they're doing it that the political leadership is behind them. And so that's what this discussion is about. It's about where is the political leadership to make sure if we ask things that are hard of our men and women in service that we're behind them. So the first question that we're wrestling with that is a controversial one is one that President Obama, I think, has decided exactly right. We have to make this decision as a nation through the elected representatives in Congress. Second question, every bit as hard. With respect to Syria, in this particular instance, do we need to contemplate military action? Now, I'll tell you something. I'm on the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees in the Senate. And I've been in the Senate since January 3rd. And I have watched on my committees senators pushing the president from the very day I came into the Senate. You need to be doing more in Syria. You need to be getting involved in this civil war in Syria. I've watched them push this president every day. You're not doing enough. You need to do more. We should be arming. We should be engaged in military. And just as this president has finished the war in Iraq and is scaling down combat operations in Afghanistan, I've watched him resist efforts to push him prematurely to action. But on August 21st, the situation changed. On August 21st, Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons to gas and kill 1,500 people, two-thirds of them civilians, 500 of them children. And this president, who has resisted members of Congress trying to push him in, said, with that, a line has been crossed. The other side's making fun of it. It's, oh, the president's trying to enforce something he said, and it's just about that. It's not about that, folks. That's not what this is about. I'm going to tell you what this is about. When American troops went to Europe in World War I, they would wake up in their trenches, coughing their lungs out, or blinded, or not wake up in their trenches because of chemical weapons. This is the first time chemical weapons were used. And World War I was a mechanized slaughter. For United States combatants, folks on the other side, a mechanized slaughter. And I'll tell you something, and this almost is absurd, really. It's kind of illogical, really. But after World War I, the nations of the world got together, and they didn't say there will be no more bombing from airplanes. That had happened in World War I, they didn't ban it. They didn't say there won't be more machine guns. That had happened in World War I, they didn't ban it. They didn't say there won't be more artillery or rockets. All that had happened in World War I, and they didn't ban it. But the nations of the world got together in 1925, and they said there will be no more use of chemical weapons. And the U.S. was on board, and Germany was on board, and the Soviet Union in 1925 was on board, and the nations of the world. And, it seems kind of absurd that in the barbarity of what war is like, that there would be a still small voice of humanity across all these cultures that would say no chemical weapons, but that's what happened. And from 1925 until Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons against civilians, only two leaders in the history of the world used chemical weapons. Adolf Hitler against millions, killing millions, and there was a consequence for that. And Saddam Hussein, first against his own people and then against Iranians, and there wasn't a consequence for that immediately. And so he kept doing it more and more and more. And eventually the world got together in the mid-90s and passed a new chemical weapons convention to ban the use of chemical weapons. So there was a consequence in that instance as well. This has been about the protection of human life, civilian life, but also the lives of American servicemen and women. American servicemen and women were gassed in World War I, but then they fought in Europe, and they fought in the Pacific, and they fought in North Africa in World War II. And then they fought in Korea, and then they fought in Vietnam, and then they fought in Iraq, and they're fighting in Afghanistan. But they've been able to fight without the fear that chemical weapons would be used against them. And the troops in every nation have been able to fight without the fear that chemical weapons would be used against them. The people who ridicule President Obama and say this is some kind of Obama red line, it's not about that. It's about a voice, a collective voice of humanity that, illogical though may it be, banded together in 1925 and said, this is beyond the pale of humanity and we won't do it. And so the president and our country are faced with a tough decision, and we in Congress are too, which is that's been breached. And not in a minor way. There was minor evidence that Assad was doing it against 3 or 4 snipers at a time, but now 1,500 deaths, 500 kids, 1,000 civilians. And the question is, will there be a consequence? Will there be a consequence? And will the United States participate in the consequence? And this is a very hard decision. In casting a vote on the Foreign Relations Committee this week to authorize the president, if he exhausts diplomatic action, to use limited strikes to punish the use of chemical weapons and deter them from being used again, I was thinking as I'm casting my vote about my own kid and about other kids. And the last thing I or any of us want to do is in a war-weary time think about more military action. And yet the schoolyard bully rule, and we've seen it play out through history, it's so often the case that when there's somebody that passes a line in an egregious way, if there's not a step taken to deter them and punish them and say, don't pass that line, they'll just keep passing it, and they'll go farther, and they'll go farther, and they'll go farther. And just as happened in Europe in the 1930s when they thought by giving Adolf Hitler part of Czechoslovakia, don't worry, now there will be peace. We'll give him the Sudetenland, and then there won't be any more bellicosity. This will satisfy him. We won't have to fight another World War. And most people agreed, and they got on board, and they did that, and they were happy that they did. But there were a few, like Churchill and George Orwell, that said, hold on a second. We've postponed our day of reckoning, but the day of reckoning is just going to be tougher, and it's going to be more severe, and we're going to be facing under more dire circumstances. And so that's why I voted this week on the Foreign Relations Committee to authorize the president, who has resisted this at every point when he could, but who has now said a norm has been crossed and the world can't stand by. If the United States acts, we will have partners. If we don't act, I don't think anyone will stand up to say that this principle that served humanity since 1925 is a principle that still needs to be honored. So I hope you'll pray for us. I hope you'll pray that we'll get together and be as wise as we can individually, but also that we'll listen to each other and that we'll have a spirit that will give us some greater wisdom as we debate this matter. I hope you'll pray not just for us, but you'll pray for the world, that maybe Syria could say, look, we'll turn our chemical weapons in. We never should have done this. Or Russia will quit blocking resolutions in the Security Council, or the UN will step forward. Pray that we find the outcome to this. But I do believe that when a line like this is crossed, it's in the interest of humanity that there be a consequence, because if there isn't, I'm just worried that we'll see more and more of it. So thanks for letting me get into that. I just felt like if I didn't say something about it, I know we're all thinking about this. I know we're all praying about it. I know we're all worried about it, and we're worried about family members. And so I just wanted to say something about it. Let me now jump from Syria to Jefferson Jackson Day. Jefferson Jackson. Why do we call these dinners Jefferson Jackson dinners? Now, there's a kind of facial answer, but then there's a more important answer, because the real answer is, why is it relevant? You know, Andy said, who cares about the past? Let's care about the now. Let's care about the future. William Faulkner, the great Southern writer, said history is the effort to create a usable past. If you can't use it, why bother? But if we can talk about a past that we can use for today and tomorrow, then that makes sense. And that's what I want to do. So here's the history, the facial history. These dinners that we do as Democrats across the country have commonly been called Jefferson Jackson dinners, because we believe Jefferson Jackson are the architects of the oldest political party in the world, the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party. A Virginian and a Tennessean. A Virginian and a Tennessean. Now, Jefferson with Madison in the 1790s created a party that was called the Democrat-Republican Party. It was funny, they were actually for short called Republicans back then, but it was the Democratic-Republican Party, and their opposite party was the Federalists. And that was the first age of parties in American life. That collapsed in the 18-teens, and the second age was ushered in, the age of Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson and others created, out of the remnants of the Democratic-Republican Party, they created the Democratic Party. And they weren't now against the Federalists, they were against the Whigs. And then by the time we got to the Civil War, the Whigs had collapsed, and the Civil War era ushered in what is the third era that has essentially been constant, Democrats and Republicans. So we honor Jefferson and Jackson, the Tennessean and the Virginian, because they were the architects of our modern party. Talk about an odd couple, Jefferson and Jackson. Good Lord. that they would be together in anything. You could hardly imagine this. These were two people who were so different. Now, I'm no historian, but just a little bit of looking, that we would call them the architects of a party means I now know why Democrats have a split personality so often. I now know why we're so disorganized so often, why it's hard to collar us so often, because we call Jefferson and Jackson our forebears. Jefferson, the elite gentry from the landed class, educated at William and Mary, the brightest mind of his day, wealthy, until he got into so much debt later, but at least he started wealthy. Andrew Jackson, the struggling frontiersman, they were completely different in their class and kind of where they came from. Their personalities were different. Jefferson was a buttoned up, kind of kept it all inside, stiff upper lip type, and Jackson, as you know, was cantankerous and boisterous and wore his emotions on the sleeve and would fly off the handle at anybody. Completely different personalities. Their attitudes toward the world. Jefferson, extremely cautious. Jackson, a little bit on the bellicose side, right? We wanted to fight duels, and he didn't mind getting involved in battles. Jefferson was pro-legislature. He liked Congress, Jim. Jefferson really liked Congress. He wanted Congress to have the power. Jackson was the guy who really started to create the strong presidency. He believed in an executive. He said, oh, those congressmen, they just represent a little district. The president represents the entire country. Jefferson was pro-states' rights. Jackson was really started to move power toward the federal government. They were different in that. Jefferson, he wouldn't exactly, Jim, be a blue dog and a fiscal conservative. The guy was a spendthrift who never met a debt that he didn't like. Whereas Andrew Jackson is the only president in the history of the United States that one day decided to and did pay off the entire national debt, right? Even if I were to think, what would Jefferson and Jackson do about Syria? The answer is exactly the opposite from each other. Jefferson would love going to Congress with the decision. Jackson would hate it. But once the decision was posed, Jefferson would be very cautious about it, and Jackson would probably say, let's go. They were completely different. So with all these differences, we still call them the architects of the party. They must have had something in common. They must have had something in common. Well, they did. First, and this has got to be humbling for all of us elected officials, they had in common they were very flawed people. Right? They were very flawed people. They were great people. They deserve a lot of things named after them and statues and courthouses, etc., but they were flawed people. They were flawed because they were both slaveholders. They were flawed because they both had really bad views about Indians. Andrew Jackson did some horrific things about Indians, and while Jefferson didn't maybe do a lot of bad stuff, Jefferson wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia in the 1780s, and he talked about Virginia Indians in a chapter called Flora and Fauna. He didn't even consider them to be like real human beings. He considered them to be flora and fauna. So one thing these guys had in common was they were flawed, and that should be a humbling thing for all of us, right? Because we're all flawed. But here's the other thing they had in common. Jefferson and Jackson, by any historian's measure, are both in the top 10 presidents in the United States. Top 10 presidents in the United States. In fact, for the last 30 or 40 years, you will survey historians, and they'll rank presidents 1 to now 44. And there's remarkable unity in the rankings. You can poll historians generally. You can poll historians who call themselves conservative. You can poll historians who call themselves liberal or progressive. And in any of those lists, 9 of the 10 will be the same. There's some debate back and forth about the 10th, but on any of the lists, Jefferson and Jackson are in the top 10. Why? Well, let me tell you why, and let me tell you why it's relevant to 2013 and 2014. And it's pretty simple, and you already know the answer. Jefferson and Jackson are the forebears of our party. Jefferson and Jackson are titanic presidential figures. Jefferson and Jackson are consensus top 10 presidents because for their times and in their way, flaws notwithstanding, they were great democratizers. Small d, democratizers. They were all about opening up the government and opening up politics to more and more people. I mean, those words of Jefferson's, what are the most memorable words in the English language? mean, it might be or not to be. It might be in the beginning God created the earth, or God created the Word. It might be. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Is there a phrase in the English language that's more known than the one that Jefferson wrote, that all men are created equal, coming from a tradition where people weren't created equal, where women weren't created equal, where immigrants weren't created equal, people weren't considered equal? Jefferson said all men are created equal. He couldn't live that way because he was human, just like the rest of us are, but he could see a North Star out there even if he couldn't get to it, and he set that out as the North Star that's been the North Star of this nation ever since. Jefferson was let's open it up, let's let everybody come to the table kind of a leader. Even in his buttoned-up gentry, sitting up at Monticello on his front porch looking down on everybody else, he was a great democratizer who wanted to open up this nation and have it be different than any nation that had existed on the earth before our nation was formed. And Jackson, for all his differences, same kind of guy. He believed that politics kept regular people out. He ran for president in 1824, and he got shut out of the presidency in 1824 by a really weird kind of corrupt backroom deal because they didn't let regular people participate in politics, and he didn't take it sitting down. And so between 1824 and 1828, Jackson really created what we would think of as modern grassroots politics to take it away from the power brokers in the back room who were trying to dictate and determine who would be president. And you know the story. Jackson got elected, and it scared the elites to death. And he had his inaugural event at the White House, and he opened it up to the public, and people were standing on chairs and breaking furniture and drinking liquor out of bathtubs. And some people thought it was horrifying, but a whole lot of other people thought, this is fantastic. It's like a modern-day JJ dinner here, you know? So both of these presidents, as different as they were, are the forebears of this party because they believed in the equality of all, and they were flawed. They didn't really see what all meant, but they knew that it was the right value, and each in their own way and in their own time did amazing things to open up a politics. And guess what? The Democratic Party has been doing that ever since, and that work continues, and it's important today. Do any of you think it's a surprise if I tell you that women's suffrage happened under a Democratic president, or Social Security happened under a Democratic president, or the GI Bill, both 1 and 2, under a Democratic president, or Medicaid and Medicare under a Democratic president, or the Civil Rights Acts under a Democratic president, or the Affordable Care Act under a Democratic president? This is exactly who we are. And Jefferson and Jackson, that's what they wanted this party to be. That's what they wanted this country to be, and that's what our values are. But I'm here to tell you, as I conclude, that this isn't, as Andy said, about what was yesterday. This is about tomorrow. Because let me tell you what we got on the deck right now, challenges that we're dealing with right now, that we could use a little bit of Jefferson and Jackson's spirit, and the nation needs it because the Democrats have the right answer to it. We're battling right now between a party that wants to expand voting rights, make it easier for people to vote, and a wave of actions all across this country by a party that wants to make it harder for people to vote. I know what Jefferson and Jackson would say about that. They'd say Democrats need to fight for voting rights. We're engaged in a series of debates in Congress and in state legislatures all over this country about the rights of women to make their own choices about their own health care and reproductive rights, but also about things like paycheck fairness, paycheck equity, the Violence Against Women Act. Who's out there battling for women's rights? It's the party of Jefferson and Jackson. Who's often standing up against us? It's the other party. Not all in the other party, right? We've got some folks who will stand up for us, but if you look at who's out there pushing the Jefferson and Jackson vision, it's the party that they created. And who's stopping us or who's getting in our way? It's the other guys. How about the rights of immigrants? In the Senate, we just passed a historic immigration reform bill. Very, very good work. And we need to get it passed. Who is out there Who is out there promoting the rights of new Americans and saying that we want to be that Statue of Liberty nation? You know, that great line of Martin Luther King's, well, we may have come over on different boats, in different ships, but we're in the same boat now. We are in the same boat now, no matter where we came from. It's the Democrats that are pushing for that, and we're so often pushing against the other side. The rights of workers, whether it's about minimum wage or working conditions, whether it's about income inequality, whether it's about something simple like a congressional battle in the Senate, the other side tried to stop us even from putting judges on the National Labor Relations Board to protect workers' rights. It's Democrats, true to the Jefferson and Jackson vision, that are standing for workers' rights. For the rights of people to be free from discrimination based on who they love, right? A modern civil rights issue of such incredible importance. I don't think Jefferson and Jackson would have seen around the corner to see that that was going to be an issue a couple of hundred years down the road. But that's the kind of the cool thing about putting equality out there as a North Star. You don't necessarily know the landscape you're going to traverse as you're moving to that North Star. And yet equality is equality. You know, it's pretty simple. Equality is equality. And it's the Democrats that are fighting for that again and again and again, and so often the other guys that are standing up against it. Health care for all, right? Health care for all. I mean, is it that hard? Is it that hard? Is it that controversial that as Jim said, the best nation in the history of the earth, the wealthiest nation that's so powerful? I go every July to a little dusty fairgrounds called the Virginia-Kentucky Fairgrounds in Wise County, Virginia, not far from Tennessee. And there's a health clinic there that is a 3-day health clinic. And people start driving in on Tuesday and Wednesday to park in a dusty fairgrounds on a hot July to wait and take a number. And they wait in line till 7 o'clock Friday morning by the tens and then the hundreds and then the thousands. And then they get their ticket and they get basic health care. And they do this in the richest nation on earth. And the first time I went to do this, to work the registration booth, I drove around the parking lot, and I guess I expected, and it wasn't surprised to see cars from Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky and West Virginia, North Carolina. But how about Oklahoma? How about Georgia? How about Florida? How about Louisiana? When I saw this for the first time, it reminded me of the way health care was delivered in Honduras when I was a missionary there, the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And in this richest and greatest nation in the history of the world, is it that controversial that we think we ought to have a health care system that can provide basic health care to all? That's what we believe. That's what Jefferson and Jackson would have believed. That's what Democrats believe, and that's why we got to keep pushing. So I guess I'm just here to say what the speakers before me has said. These values, you know, this is old-time religion, folks. I'm not telling you anything new. The Democratic Party doesn't need to kind of come up with a new game plan or a new set of principles or values. When we celebrate Jefferson and Jackson, we're celebrating two people who started this party, but they started it as people who wanted to always broaden, always bring more people to the table, always look to expand opportunity. That's why we're great as a nation. That's why we're great as a party. So at the end of the day, this is why Tennessee Democrats or Virginia Democrats or National Democrats, this is why we have to be successful. You know, it's about candidates, it's about state parties, it's about good organizations, but we're here to make a difference for people. And we're here to make a difference for people and expand those opportunities in this greatest nation on earth, because we can look around us every day and see things that are working okay, things that are better than they were 10 years ago. But we can also see things that aren't near what they ought to be. You know, jobs that need to be developed, and schools that need to be improved, and public safety that can be improved, and the relations with the nations of the world that can be better. And this vision that our founding members, Jefferson and Jackson, had is still as relevant today as it was in the 1790s or as it was in the 1820s. And I tell you, I'll just conclude and say this. I love being with Democrats. You know, often I'm with people, and again, I will say this, there's some great Republicans. My political hero, my father-in-law, Linwood Holton, Republican governor of Virginia, integrated the public schools of Virginia after the preceding Democratic governors had kept the schools segregated for a long time. So, look, we want to take allies wherever we can. But like my father-in-law says, he still calls himself a Republican. It's just that he only votes for Democrats these days. Because he looks at these values and he looks at the trajectory that our nations are on or that the party's on, and he says, I want to be marching toward that North Star, you know? When that Virginian put equality up there as our North Star, no one could have ever done better. But we're not there yet, and we got to keep marching. And it's the Democrats that are marching. And at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's our passion, it's our belief, it's knowing that our values are right, it's our energy. And we all believe, I know, that there may be dark times and challenges and races that don't work out the way we hope, but we're on the right track. We've been on the right track as a nation. We've been on the right track as a party. And if we keep true to those values, we're going to have a lot of wins. We're going to do a lot of good. Thanks for having me with you tonight. Take care.